A fall from the 22nd floor, a diplomat dead in Paris, and a truth too dangerous to name. It was the morning of September 30th, 2025, when the world awoke to a chilling headline: South Africa's ambassador to France found dead in Paris. The City of Light's symbol of diplomacy, of culture, of human rights, had just become the stage of something darker. At the Hyatt Regency Paris Étoile, a body lay twisted in the courtyard beneath a broken window on the 22nd floor. Within hours, officials declared it suicide. They pointed to a text message to his wife, a pair of scissors near the window, and a quiet hotel corridor as proof that this tragedy was self-inflicted. Case closed. But those who knew Nathi Mthethwa, the former Minister of Police, a veteran of South Africa's liberation struggle, a man who once stood inside the deepest circles of power, refused to accept that explanation. For this was not a man easily broken. He had survived scandals, inquiries, and political storms. He was the keeper of secrets that could rattle nations. And now he was gone. So what truly happened in that Parisian hotel room? Was it despair or was it silencing? Did a troubled man take his own life, or was he erased because he knew too much? Because for millions watching from Johannesburg to Washington, from Durban to Dakar, this was more than one man's death. It was a mirror reflecting the fear that truth itself is no longer safe, a fear that when power is threatened, silence becomes the final sentence. And that is why tonight we ask the question no one dares to answer: who killed the truth in Paris? Stay with us, because this story isn't about one diplomat's fall. It's about the soul of South Africa, the meaning of sovereignty, and the dangerous cost of justice in a world where secrets kill. If you believe truth must outlive silence, share this story, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe. Because justice is not charity, it is sovereignty. And it begins with you. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a newsflash that broke the rhythm of an ordinary morning. South Africa's ambassador to France, Nathi Mthethwa, found dead in Paris. The headline was clinical, almost sterile, but the shock it carried was seismic. The location itself made the story surreal: the Hyatt Regency Paris Étoile, a tower of steel and glass near the Arc de Triomphe, a place of diplomats, business magnates, and the discreet luxury of international power. Yet, on that September morning, beneath the hotel's 22nd floor window, the lifeless body of one of South Africa's most controversial statesmen lay surrounded by police tape. The French authorities moved quickly. By noon, their statement was ready: suicide. Evidence, they said, was overwhelming. A message of apology sent to his wife in Johannesburg. A window forced open, apparently with a pair of scissors. No drugs, no alcohol, no struggle. A simple, tragic story of a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own past. But in South Africa, few believed simplicity. For decades, Nathi Mthethwa had lived inside the machinery of power where simplicity never existed. He rose through the ranks of the African National Congress (ANC) as a trusted strategist, a loyal enforcer, and a political survivor. From 2009 to 2014, he served as Minister of Police, presiding over one of the darkest chapters in post-apartheid history, the Marikana massacre of 2012, when police opened fire on striking miners, killing 34 and wounding 78. The footage of that day haunted the nation, and Mthethwa, though denying direct responsibility, carried the shadow of that tragedy wherever he went. When he later became Minister of Arts and Culture and then of Sports, arts and culture critics mocked these softer portfolios as political exile in disguise, designed to move him out of direct controversy while preserving his place within the ANC's inner circle. He was, as some described, too powerful to fall, too tainted to rise. Then came the commissions. The Zondo Commission on State Capture, investigating years of corruption under President Zuma, heard testimony implicating Mthethwa in political interference, especially in the reappointment of a controversial intelligence chief, Richard Mduli. Another inquiry, the Madlanga Commission, raised allegations that he had misused state resources, including the infamous claim that Secret Service funds were used to build a wall around his private KwaZulu-Natal residence. He denied it all. The smoke never cleared. By late 2023, his appointment as ambassador to France was announced. To some, it was a graceful exit, a reward for loyalty. To others, a relocation strategy, a way to move a man full of secrets far from Pretoria's crumbling center of power. But exile in Paris brought no peace. In private conversations, colleagues described him as restless, paranoid, and withdrawn. He reportedly feared surveillance, often changing hotels instead of using his official residence. One aide recalled him saying, "You don't know how deep this goes." So when the call came from Paris on September 30th, shock was not mixed with surprise, it was mixed with suspicion. Why that hotel? Why that night? Why that method? The details began to feel choreographed. The scissors forcing the window, the message sent at 3:12 a.m., reading more like a code than a farewell, the absence of struggle in a man known to fight. And yet within hours, both French and South African officials were united in their verdict: suicide. There would be no questions asked, no cross-border inquiry, no diplomatic scandal. But for millions of South Africans watching the story unfold, something didn't add up. A man who had survived public outrage, parliamentary hearings, and commissions of inquiry had supposedly ended his life alone in a foreign hotel room, using scissors to pry open a window in the middle of the night. It was too strange, too precise, too political. As journalists scrambled to make sense of the contradictions, one word began to appear in headlines across Johannesburg and Durban: silencing. Because in South Africa's political lexicon, suicide rarely means despair. It means someone somewhere wanted a door closed forever. The first doubts surfaced quietly, a whisper here, a question there, and then, like a crack spreading across glass, they could no longer be contained. Anonymous leaks began circulating within French media circles. Journalists from Le Monde and Africa Intelligence received files allegedly from inside the French investigative unit. They described inconsistencies that shattered the tidy suicide narrative. The text message that was said to be a farewell to his wife. According to unverified metadata, it had not been sent from the hotel room at all, but from a location several blocks away. The tone of the message also differed sharply from what officials had claimed: less coherent, more panicked, as if typed in haste or under duress. Then came the photograph's forensic images, showing that the window mechanism had been forced with unusual strength, inconsistent with Mthethwa's own physical profile. DNA traces on the scissors and window ledge reportedly did not match his. If true, these details rewrote the entire story. This was no suicide. It was a stage set, a crime scene choreographed to look like despair. By the time French authorities dismissed the leaks as rumors, the fire had already spread. In South Africa, hashtags like Justice for Mthethwa and Feed on Truth in Paris exploded across social media. Influencers, activists, and journalists demanded to know why the French police had moved so fast to close the case. The tone online was electric, emotional, defiant. If they can kill him in Paris, one user wrote, "What chance do whistleblowers have in Pretoria?" Television anchors replayed the same haunting footage: the courtyard, the broken window, the white sheet covering the ambassador's body, over and over again. On talk shows, commentators clashed live on air. Some argued that guilt and shame had finally caught up with Mthethwa, that the scandals of Marikana and the state capture inquiry had crushed him. Others saw the opposite, that his very survival through those scandals had made him dangerous to those still in power. He was, they said, a man who knew too much, and Paris was his execution ground. Inside, the ANC panic met silence. The party issued a brief statement of grief, but avoided the words investigation or controversy. It was the same silence that had defined so many political deaths before. But this time, the public didn't let go. Opposition parties seized the moment. The Democratic Alliance DA called for a parliamentary inquiry, warning that truth must not die in a foreign hotel room. The Economic Freedom Fighters EFF went further, accusing the ruling party of orchestrating exile as a form of political disposal. They sent him to Paris not to represent South Africa, but to bury him alive. Internationally, the shockwaves deepened. At first, French media had echoed the official line, but within days, Le Monde published an editorial titled "The Silence of Paris," calling for full transparency. Across the Atlantic, American networks like CNN and MSNBC aired segments questioning how a diplomat under official protection could die under such bizarre circumstances. Analysts connected the case to the South Africa corruption scandal of 2025, suggesting Mthethwa might have been preparing to turn state witness. And then came the street response. In KwaZulu-Natal, his home province, hundreds gathered for vigils that quickly transformed into protests. The chants were not of mourning, but of fury. Who killed him? Who silenced him? No more lies in Paris. Candles flickered beside cardboard signs that read, "Justice is not suicide." In Johannesburg, students marched to the French consulate demanding an international investigation. For the first time in years, South Africans of every background, ANC loyalists, opposition supporters, church groups, even veterans of the liberation struggle, found themselves united by disbelief. The official narrative had collapsed. The image of Mthethwa's body beneath that 22nd floor window became more than a photo. It was a national symbol of betrayal. Every unanswered question added to the weight of outrage. Why that hotel? Why no security footage released? Why the rush to close the file? And as the days turned into weeks, one sentence began to echo through the airwaves, the streets, and the hearts of millions. This was not suicide. This was silencing. The truth was no longer confined to investigators or politicians. It had become public property, a storm no government could contain. The death of Ambassador Nathi Mthethwa did not fade into memory. It metastasized, spreading through South African society like a political fever. What began as a tragedy in Paris soon evolved into a reckoning at home, a storm that exposed the fragility of justice and the deep rot within the nation's corridors of power. In the weeks that followed, vigil after vigil filled the streets of KwaZulu-Natal. But these gatherings were not quiet prayers, they were acts of defiance. Old women raised candles and shouted through tears. Young people carried placards reading, "Who killed him?" and "No more deaths in silence." Priests led hymns that dissolved into chants. The line between grief and protest blurred. Across Soweto, Durban, and Johannesburg, radio stations became confession booths for a nation's conscience. Callers from taxi drivers to former civil servants spoke with the same tremor of disbelief. If even an ambassador can be silenced abroad, what chance do the rest of us have? The sentiment was raw and unanimous. Mthethwa's death had become shorthand for a deeper wound, a system that devours its own when truth becomes inconvenient. Politically, the timing could not have been worse for the ruling African National Congress, ANC. With the 2026 elections approaching, the party was already suffering from internal fractures and public fatigue. Factional battles within the ANC had turned every scandal into a weapon, and Mthethwa's mysterious death became the sharpest of all. Reformists within the party demanded an independent inquiry. Loyalists urged silence, warning that foreign forces would use the case to discredit the government. The tension grew unbearable. Leaked memos suggested that some senior officials feared Mthethwa had indeed been preparing to testify in a corruption case that implicated top figures within the intelligence and security apparatus. The opposition saw their opening. The Democratic Alliance launched a nationwide campaign titled Justice for Truth, framing Mthethwa's death as a test of whether South Africa still had the moral backbone to confront its own corruption. The economic freedom fighters, more fiery, accused the ANC of outsourcing its assassinations to foreign soil. Their rallies drew thousands. Red flags filled the air as speakers shouted, "They killed him in Paris because they couldn't silence him in Pretoria." In the diplomatic community, the impact was chilling. South African envoys posted abroad privately began to question their own safety. Rumors spread of encrypted emails, missing files, and subtle threats from within the bureaucracy. One mid-level diplomat told a journalist, "When you serve the truth, you serve without armor." Meanwhile, civil society found its voice again. Church leaders, NGOs, and university students joined forces to demand transparency. The call for a commission of inquiry into Mthethwa's death grew louder each week. Editorials warned that if the government buried this case, it would bury the last remnants of public faith along with it. Economically, investors grew uneasy. The image of a senior ambassador dying mysteriously in Europe cast a long shadow over South Africa's credibility. Markets reacted nervously. Analysts spoke of political risk contagion. Behind the numbers, however, lay something more human, the erosion of trust. And through it all, one realization crystallized across the nation. This was not just about Nathi Mthethwa. It was about a government that could no longer protect its own. It was about a people exhausted by commissions that ended in silence, by justice delayed until it became meaningless. It was about the unbearable question echoing from every township to every embassy. If truth itself can fall from the 22nd floor, what future does South Africa have for the first time in years? That question united the country not in despair but in resolve. Because every chain, no matter how heavy, eventually breaks. While South Africa mourned and protested, the world began to take notice. The death of a sitting ambassador in one of Europe's safest capitals was never going to remain a domestic affair. It touched the fragile nerves of diplomacy, the sanctity of international law, the trust between nations, and the quiet question whispered in embassies from Brussels to Washington. If an African ambassador can die mysteriously in Paris, what does sovereignty really mean? In France, the initial calm dissolved into embarrassment. The French police had rushed to declare suicide within hours, eager to protect the image of order and safety. But as leaks multiplied and pressure mounted, opposition MPs in the French National Assembly began demanding transparency. Le Monde, Libération, and Mediapart all ran editorials accusing their own government of convenient silence. A handful of parliamentarians even called for a special oversight committee, arguing that if the death of a diplomat could be politically sanitized, France risked undermining its credibility as a guardian of human rights and justice. The French Foreign Ministry, cornered by the controversy, issued a brief statement. "We continue to cooperate fully with South African authorities." But insiders described a different scene: diplomatic panic, frantic phone calls between Paris and Pretoria, and classified discussions about whether the hotel's surveillance footage should ever be released. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, the reaction was sharper. AU chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat, usually cautious, declared that the safety of Africa's diplomats abroad is a question of continental dignity. Behind closed doors, African envoys were furious. One ambassador was quoted saying, "If this can happen to one of us in Paris, then none of us are truly sovereign." The AU's Peace and Security Council debated whether to demand a joint AU-EU investigation, but France resisted, arguing it would set a dangerous precedent. The tension between African sovereignty and European discretion was now visible for all to see. Across the Atlantic, Washington watched with measured interest. The U.S. State Department offered condolences, but followed with a statement carefully worded for maximum pressure. The protection of diplomats and the transparency of investigations are essential pillars of international trust. American analysts went further. On MSNBC, a former U.S. ambassador warned that the case symbolizes a deeper rot in South Africa's ruling elite and questioned whether Pretoria's silence hinted at complicity. CNN aired a segment linking Mthethwa's death to the broader South Africa corruption scandal of 2025, calling it a test of how far accountability can survive in a post-liberation democracy. In Brussels, European Union officials held discreet consultations. Several members of the European Parliament argued for an independent inquiry, citing obligations under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which requires host states to guarantee the safety of accredited envoys. Meanwhile, international NGOs like Amnesty International and Transparency International joined the chorus. They demanded both governments, France and South Africa, permit an independent forensic review, warning that without full transparency, perception becomes truth. But the reactions were not purely institutional, they were moral. Around the world, commentators began asking a different kind of question. What does it say about our global system when justice can be negotiated and death becomes diplomacy? By October's end, the case had moved beyond politics. It became a symbol of how Africa's sovereignty was still tested not only by coups and wars, but by silence and secrecy in foreign capitals. The truth about Nathi Mthethwa's death remained elusive. But its implications were now global. It forced the world to look into its own reflection, to ask whether justice without courage is anything more than theater. The image remains frozen in the world's mind: a courtyard in Paris, a white sheet fluttering in the wind, and beneath it the body of a man who carried the secrets of a nation. For some, Nathi Mthethwa's fall will always represent despair, the slow collapse of a politician haunted by guilt. For others, it is unmistakably the mark of silencing and execution disguised as suicide, a message written not in ink, but in blood. But beyond the mystery lies a far greater truth. This was never just about one man. It was about the erosion of trust between the governed and the governors, between Africa and the world that still claims to protect it. When an African ambassador can die in the heart of Europe, wrapped in silence and convenience, the question is no longer who killed him. The question is, who will protect the truth when it's no longer safe to speak? In South Africa, the aftermath has already begun. The words 22nd floor now echo in the streets like a wound that won't close. Young people wear black ribbons with his initials, students debate corruption and sovereignty in classrooms, and families whisper that justice has no passport. Every vigil, every chant, every headline has transformed this tragedy into a mirror showing a nation its own reflection, bruised but unbroken. And yet within that reflection lies a choice: to bury this story like so many before it under bureaucracy, fatigue, and fear, or to let it become the spark that reignites South Africa's conscience. Because if this death becomes another statistic, then the fall from that 22nd floor will not have ended with Mthethwa. It will have dragged down the nation's dignity with him. But if South Africans choose courage, if they demand the truth from Paris, from Pretoria, and from every corridor of power, then something remarkable can emerge from the silence, a rebirth of accountability, of sovereignty, rooted not in status but in truth. The world is watching. From Washington to Dakar, from Ouagadougou to Cape Town. Every nation that values its freedom must ask itself, what good is sovereignty if truth can be killed in its name? Because justice is not charity. It is not given. It is earned through courage, through memory, through refusal to forget. And that is why the story of the 22nd floor cannot end in silence. It must echo in every parliament, every embassy, every home that dares to believe Africa deserves more than secrecy. So if you believe truth must outlive silence, share this story, speak it aloud, subscribe for the next chapter, because sovereignty begins with truth, and truth begins with those who refuse to look away.